Here we go. Well, good evening or good afternoon, everyone on Facebook. Really good to see you. I'm going to share on a topic that's huge, but my aim here is just to bring it right down to where we're at. So maybe bear with me a little bit. Oh dear, going to get the echo again. Right, there we go. Got the echo off. Okay, well, 8 years ago, I remember a really hot and humid evening in Lilongwe in Malawi. And I distinctly remember candlelight, which, probably means that, as was normal in those days, we were experiencing what we called a blackout. There was a power cut as they load shedded all the time. I'd been serving alongside Sean Campon-Denny as his associate pastor for 5 years, and time was drawing to a close. I was due to go home, and just a few months' time, really. And I just remember Sean ushering me outside, and I thought there was something serious going on with this conversation. And in hushed tones, Sean told me that his father-in-law not only was running for head of a political party, but would be running for president in just 2 years' time. Bonkers. I mean, his family and Lazarus himself, they were not politicians. Lazarus, just like Sean, he was a pastor. And what followed was not necessarily what he had expected. He had heard the call from God. You can watch this on YouTube, actually, where he felt called to pastor a nation. But what actually followed were quite barren, difficult times for the whole family and for Lazarus himself. In 2015, he finished down the pecking order in third place, and his family had been given a really hard time. He persevered and regrouped, and in 2019, he became the favourite to take over as president. Things looked really differently, but he was pipped at the post in terms of the votes counted by the incumbent, by the current president. And there was just a few votes in it. But as has always been the case in so many countries around the world, but when I was in Malawi, it always seemed so obvious. There were real clear signs of tampering and vote rigging. And this time, unrest reared its head in the country. There was great potential for violence here. People were not happy. They were not happy with the current administration, and they were not happy with the way it was so blatantly cheating to be with the election results. Yet Lazarus stood up and demanded really peace. He wanted a peaceful approach to this, and he promised that he would bring the results to court and that there would be justice. And a long process ensued, but ultimately the Electoral Commission and their results were overturned. And this has never happened really globally. There's one other example in Kenya, but what then happened was just a few weeks ago, Lazarus and a party called Tonse, they came together and Lazarus was made president. They reran the election and he won fair and square. The country is full of joy at the moment, at this time. Lazarus gave great examples throughout his time of speaking truth to power. He refused to cozy up to politicians and politics. He didn't give up. He refused to allow setbacks to deflate him. He faced death threats in his time. He faced a brutal handling at one point by the police. He was nearly killed, and he believed in the end that justice would prevail if he stuck to the truth. There's a little known story in all of this, though, that I want to go back to that night. And it's a story that Sean let me in on that night. So many years ago, 8 years ago. And it goes back to just before, actually, that we had that hushed conversation, the crickets singing and the oppressive heat. Lazarus was to take over from a political group that was led by John Tembo. Tembo is a famous Malawian politician who was at times, actually, at certain times during Kamuzu Banda's reign as dictator, he was almost the right-hand man, if not the right-hand man. I mean, Kamuzu Banda himself had led the country to independence in 1964 and then oversaw an oppressive dictatorship. But that culminated in him also overseeing a peaceful transition into democracy. It's a remarkable country, Malawi. Something so peaceful about the way they establish rule. And I don't know those stories firsthand, but I have an inside track into the conversations that were had as Lazarus took over the political party. He was committed to his relationships. He was committed to loving these people. And he took his opportunities to speak truth to power in a remarkably humble way. Listen, most of us will never get an experience like that. Most of us will not be leaders of nations or talking directly to leaders of nations. But we all regularly come into contact with people that have power over us and power over other people. Your boss at work, your church leader, your mother figure in your family, the football team coach or manager, your local councillors and MPs, your school teachers, your chairperson of a group that you are part of. Who do you interact with? And the question this raises for me is, do I have the patience and the will and the sacrifice to not only love these people so much, to not only love them that much, but that to also speak the truth to them? What Lazarus shows us is that you need wisdom and you need a craft in your approach. But you know what? The Spirit of God is upon you, and so you can do this. And we have a really good example in the Bible too. We can take the story of Nathan. King David, the greatest king Israel has ever seen before Jesus, was abusing his power terribly. So this is a good king that had got into corruption and abuse of power. He was caught up in a trap of greed and lust. He abused his power to then cover that up. And so he was directly responsible for taking, maybe even forcing another man's wife into his bed. And then he was responsible for using his powerful position to cover it up and to keep control. He maneuvered his army so that the husband of the wife would end up on the front line and surely die. These acts have had far-reaching consequences for generations, but we do see a turnaround moment, an amazing change in the leadership, and it comes with the example of Nathan. Nathan had the ear of the king. He was in the king's palace. And he sets an example not through loud protest, not through rallying the support of other people and gossip and division, not through harsh rebuke, not through staying quiet and becoming complicit in the corruption and the power. Actually, he gives us an example by taking a huge risk upon himself, but doing it with love and gently and humbly, and with a fair element of craft. It was not straightforward what he achieved. We can read about it in 2 Samuel 12, but really simply, he tells a story to the king of a rich man who had a whole flock of sheep and lambs and used a very, very rich man at his disposal. But instead of using them, he takes a poor man's lamb, a poor man who loved his only lamb, and he used that lamb instead. And David, upon hearing this story, shakes with anger. Who is this man, he says, and I can imagine David was ready to rain down justice upon this man's head. And Nathan probably painfully points out, this man is you, king. I imagine Nathan had deep sorrow in his heart, and I imagine he did it in a way that he took no delight in delivering. There is so much injustice in this world today, and so much of it ends up in violent protest. But I believe that it never has to end, or never has to get there in the first place. So many of us are in so few of us are actually in David's position. And if we are in a position of power, we need to listen to the Nathans around us. Nathan has our back and he speaks in love. But so many of us are in Nathan's position. We have people that we interact with that have power over us and over other people. And we need to speak gently to them, taking our opportunity to point out the injustices that they're being delivered by their hands. It might start in our homes. It might start with a mother or a father figure abusing their position as head of the household. I have seen this, and I've been guilty at times of myself by abusing my power myself. Maybe it's laziness and you let other people do the work for you because you can just direct it that way. Or maybe it's even worse, and I've heard of stories of parents eating while their children stay hungry. But it might be something else. It might be a boss at work who steals, and I've seen this myself, a manager who takes credit, a lazy manager who takes the credit of his hardworking team. It might be a head teacher that never gets their head out of the office to see what the school is really like. and to speak truth to power in these situations, gently, appropriately, without becoming complicit to it. Or maybe you have a church leader who shouts angrily at his teams over speaking over the top of them and not allowing people to speak. Or maybe you have someone in your church who is in leadership that prays inappropriately with or for the opposite sex. We need to speak truth to that power. Many of us will never end up directly influencing the head of nations, just like Lazarus or Nathan. But we are all subject to people who are in power. And can you imagine if we get this right? Can you imagine the ripple effects changing power structures throughout for good and beyond our own sphere of influence? For most, the thought of nations is just too large. For most people, we can only see the step in front of us. And I think God wants us to take that step. It's a simple step. And if we take the step in front of us, who knows what will ripple out and change for good. This is a game-changing approach, and it's how to speak truth to power. Thank you for being with me.